Hi, I'm John,
And I'm Meredith.
and this is No Talking in the Library, coming to you actually from the library.
We're happy to be back.
We certainly are. It's a little weird being in the building without any patrons in it, but hopefully down the road that's going to happen too. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Chernobyl miniseries that was done by HBO. It came out last year. We had thought about doing this when we first sort of started doing these episodes again. But at that point, the pandemic was a little new and it was a little upsetting for people. And we didn't necessarily think that, talking about a sort of disaster like this would necessarily be something people would be all that interested in the moment. But as things have gone on, we seem to be finding our way through it, although certainly no end seems immediately in sight. But we saw this miniseries around the time that it came out, and it's just so fabulous that we thought we would spend a little of our time, a little of your time, talking about how much we love it.
Yeah, so as John said, it is an HBO miniseries that aired about this time last year. It is about the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. The series point of view is from one of the lead scientists brought in to sort of figure out what happened that night that the reactor exploded. The scientist played by Jared Harris, the characters, and also the man's name, Valery Legasov. And he spends the time of the episodes, the hours, the days, the months, the years after the disaster, trying to answer the question, how does an RBMK reactor explode? Because at that time, the belief was that it doesn't.
Yeah, so for those who don't recall, this was the 26th of April, 1986, in the sort of wee hours of the morning. A nuclear plant outside of the city of Pripyat in the Ukraine. They decided they were going to do a safety test. They meant to actually do it earlier in the day. There was some confusion about the personnel, and they didn't want to take the power down while factories were running in the middle of the day. So they ended up doing it with a different shift at 1 a.m. With absolutely catastrophic consequences. The top blew off it, and many other bad things happened. And this miniseries, so one of the things we talked about that we both really loved about it is that instead of a kind of long build-up to the disaster itself, the movie starts basically with a boom, and then goes from there.
Yeah, I really like that. When I was watching Waco and when we talked about that, Chernobyl came up as well as sort of another one of these series about an event. And there's definitely the when are we going to get to it feeling that you can get that sort of makes the episodes feel like they're dragging on. And I never get that feeling. I've seen the series Chernobyl probably 4 or 5 times, and I never get that feeling, partly because it does start, with the explosion. You see it from the point of view of a woman who's woken up in the middle of the night, and then it cuts to the men in the sort of control room, just completely unsure as to what has just happened. And then the sort of the push of the narrative at that point is sort of picking apart and trying to figure out what happened, figure out why it is that it exploded. And it becomes to the point where by the last episode, you've become so hooked in the lives of these characters and sort of the science and the sort of political machinations. You just can't wait to hear the explanation. And it's just a great sort of way of keeping the series going.
Yeah, the series is just incredibly well cast. Jared Harris absolutely does a star turn. People who are fans of Mad Men, he was certainly excellent in that series. He takes it to a complete other level of of excellence in this series. He's paired with Stellan Skarsgård, who plays Boris Sherbina, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Soviet Union. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the kind of historical compressions that go on. But I will say that they really went to great lengths to make this as authentic as it possibly could. I was looking on the internet at some pictures from where, you know, they have this site where they sort of show stills from the series, and they show images from, you know, what they're meant to represent. And they got the control room exactly right. A lot of the characters they got absolutely perfectly. They cast Con O'Neill as Viktor Bryukhanov, the plant supervisor, and he is eerily perfect. I mean, he really looks exactly like the guy. It's kind of startling. So there's a point, of course, there's a trial about this, and there's a still from the trial of Anatoly Dyatlov, who was the sort of immediate supervisor running the test, Viktor Bryukhanov, and Nikolai Fomin, who was the other supervisor. And there's a still from the trial, and clearly they've seen it, because there's a still from the show where it's exactly, I mean, Fomin is sitting kind of on the other, like at the other end of the table from where he was actually sitting, but they got their jackets exactly right. They got the color of their shirts exactly right. I mean, it's a level of detail that's just really, really remarkable.
And it should come to no surprise, because this series was created and developed and written by Craig Mazin, and this man did just extensive research, a lot of which came from a book called Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich. And like, again, Waco, which was drawn from book by someone who's actually there, and I think I had mentioned one about Jonestown. These are books that are collections of recollections from people who actually were there when this happened. So there's a lot of first person point of view that can be drawn from to get those details so right. And that book is available through OverDrive if it is something that you find yourself interested in.
Yeah, I happened to read it right after watching the series, and they really did an excellent job of integrating content from the book and from what's known about what happened into the series, so that when you're sort of looking at the control room and the conversations and the interactions that went on in the control room, there's a lot of points at which what's said in the show is exactly what was said by the people in the moment. To get back to the sort of opening, it's really sometimes with these things, as you were saying earlier, with shows about an event like this, there's a kind of a lead up, and what they're sort of banking on is kind of building up kind of tension. You know something like bad is going to happen, but you can't really. You have to sort of wait, and that's sort of one kind of narrative. In here, it's just like, boom, here it is. Here's the nuclear accident right now, and then it just gets worse. That whole like first episode when they're just trying to figure out what just happened here. I mean, there's the moment where I think it's Sitnikov comes in and says, there is no more reactor core. I just looked at it, and Dadlov's not like, no, that can't be the truth. And it just illustrates, I mean, this is one reason why it's sort of relevant to our situation now, in the respect that, the Soviet Union was a society with a lot of problems. It was an authoritarian communist society with, well, a lot of problems, an economy that didn't work and a lot of other things, but also an authority structure that was really unhealthy. So that what happens, and you see this, and this happens a lot, when the accident happens, these guys immediately go into cover your butt mode because they don't want to be on the hook for what happened. So they're minimizing, they're sort of deflecting. And
they keep sharing, not to cut in, they keep also sharing the same incorrect piece of information about that's one of, it's not funny, but it's funny because they keep sharing the number of the radiation from the explosion.
3,600 rads. That's not bad. It's not terrible.
And it's like, that's just the number, the highest number that they're like, Geiger, I don't know, machine Geiger counter, dosimeter, goes to. So of course that's the number that they get.
Right. It's really fascinating that the way that happens, like there's a kind of a groupthink that happens where, there's a couple of them who know the dosimeter only goes up to 3,600 rads. And then you don't know how much after that, but they, at that point, there's like, okay, what are we going to tell the sort of party bosses here? What are we going to say? And the thing gets completely out of control. And, you come to sort of find out later that the rot went even deeper than that. So, one of the sort of key takeaways of this, and there are certainly many, is you have to sort of trust scientists. Science doesn't get everything right, but it gets things righter than just what you wish was the case. And so much of this, especially in that first episode, is people saying things that they wish were true.
It's Craig Mazin's whole thesis statement for this series. The through line through the entire series, the one that is always there hand in hand with the science, is what is the cost of lies. And there's a great quote. Valery Legasov is sort of recording his memoirs after, I think it's 2 years after the events at Chernobyl, where they finally have, pieced together what happened. And he says, what is the cost of lies? It's not that we'll mistake them for the truth. The real danger is that if we hear enough lies, then we no longer recognize the truth at all. And, I don't want to make too many comparisons to what's happening in current events or current, politics, but you can't help but, especially in this culture that we live in now of like social media, constant 24-hour news cycle, you can't help but draw comparisons to, all of the information that we get these days, and how much of it comes from just misinformation or malintent, and or just game of telephone spread.
Right. There's that that's the line that you cite is just incredibly powerful. And there's another moment where Legasov is being sort of getting his knuckles rapped by the KGB, by a general from the KGB, and he's talking about the danger, because the Soviet Union has a whole bunch has 10 other RBMK reactors, and Legasov has basically said, there's a problem and it needs to be addressed. And the KGB guy is saying, well, you shouldn't have said that in public, basically. And then he says, why worry about something that's never going to happen? And Legasov kind of laughs and says, yeah, that's great. We should put that on our money. And it's really true. It's really, this sort of, why don't we just sort of focus on what we want to be the case rather than, and why don't we openly admit it when we have these facts? Let's openly talk about them rather than, try and spin it some other way or what have you. So there's a lot of other sort of, the narrative itself is really fascinating. It has this beautiful sort of circular structure where it kind of comes back to where it started. But it also has a lot of other really excellent things going on. And the number one thing is the sort of atmosphere that it creates. It just creates this absolutely uncanny atmosphere. It's like watching a horror movie, which is especially horrifying because it's true. Like all these things are things that that happened. And it just creates this sort of, every episode has these moments where the vibe is just absolutely chilling.
I mean, they have just the most wonderfully horrifying setting of that Soviet bloc architecture that is just awful. Like, you and I have both been to East Berlin and can vouch firsthand that it's really unsettling.
Right. Yeah. It's so inhuman. I mean, it's funny that the East Germans used to, East German citizens, not the government, used to refer to those tiny apartments as worker mailboxes. And the interesting thing about Pripyat too is that was a fairly privileged place to live. I found from talking to people who were familiar with the Soviet Union in that period. All the worse. But one of the things that really makes this atmosphere is the soundtrack, which was done by Hildur Guðmundsdóttir, and it's just absolutely terrifying in this very minimalist way.
It's a lot of very like sort of deep tones that feel like it just reverberates in your chest and like shakes your bones.
Right. There was a moment where, when we were coming in, when it was clear that the library was going to close for this, and we weren't sort of sure, this was, several weeks ago, and we didn't really know what was going on. When I came in, I had just gotten the soundtrack, and I came in and I put it I played it on the computer in our office, and you and I were standing in there, and about 3 minutes, and we're like, yeah, we got to turn this off. This is really freaking us out. But it sort of creates an atmosphere of utter horror. But also, a thing I really enjoyed about this was that a lot of it was about this unbelievable heroism of people, whether born out of kind of loyalty to the state or loyalty to their fellow man. There's that whole sort of segment where there's 3 guys. They have to get 3 volunteers to go into the bottom of the plant and open these valves. And they're going into a high radiation area where, it's pretty clear that they're very explicit. This is, this is a suicide mission. And they do it. They get 3 guys to actually volunteer to do it. And that's really intense, I mean, it's it gives you this sort of picture of what human beings are about that kind of balances out the sort of worser qualities that you see from the people running the operation. Yeah,
there's even a huge group, which have the name, and I believe this is historically accurate, the Liquidators. Liquidators, who were just the men and women who were responsible for the cleanup of Chernobyl. And one of the greatest scenes in the entire 5-episode series is demonstrating how they were cleaning the roof of the reactor building, which is at this point still covered in just massively radioactive concrete and graphite from the explosion. And they need it to be clean before they can do the containment, before they can build sort of the like shield to enclose the exposed like core. And they need like hundreds and hundreds of men to wear these really not very safe looking suits to just more or less shovel concrete off the edge of the roof back into the open core. And they can only be exposed to about 60 or 90 seconds of this radiation before it starts to actually, probably melt their skin. And, there was just no other way. They tried different robots and stuff, and literally the only way to do it was with manpower. And the citizens rose to it because there was no other way. If they left it open, it would just destroy probably that region, the environment, for who knows how many years.
Right. Large parts of the Ukraine were going to become uninhabitable, and severe damage would be done to Central and Western Europe too. And those guys, that was a one-time thing too. You could only do it one time, and then and that was all the radiation that you could really absorb, for your life. And the same way, the coal miners that they got to go down and dig the passages underneath. And it was clear. I mean, they say to the leader of the miners organization, the leader of the miners union at the beginning, like, yeah, there's, this is you're going to absorb like this large amount of radiation, and it's probably going to be lethal. And they're just like, okay, well, we've got to do it. This is what we do, and that's just. So it's a story with a whole sort of bunch of really interesting elements that come together into something that's really interesting. Did you know? Say this was directed by a guy named Johan Rank, he did work on Vikings, he did work on Breaking Bad. Do you know what his next gig is?
I don't.
He has been hired to direct The Last of Us series.
I should have said that, because of course creator Craig Mazin is also directing or creating the Last of Us series based on the Naughty Dog video game.
Right.
I should have guessed that. If you're a big fan of Chernobyl, like I was, and I definitely needed to know more about the event, the people, just everything. Craig Mazin actually participated in a companion podcast for the series, hosted by Peter Sagal of NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And there is an episode of the podcast for each episode of the show where, and then there's a bonus episode with Jared Harris, star of the series. And each episode, Craig Mazin kind of walks the listener through, his inspiration, some of the changes that he had to make, what he believed was to be accurate. Obviously, this is a drama, so I know that there's been some criticism to how historically accurate it's been. I think the biggest change was Emily Watson plays a scientist, Alania Homiuk, and she was a made-up character because Legasov worked with a whole team of scientists, and she was sort of created to be an amalgam of those scientists, obviously to streamline for narrative purposes. But it's just really interesting to hear his perspective and, why he made the choices that he did in terms of changes, and just interesting to hear him talk about, his process. So that's a really great podcast.
Yeah, the podcast is really good. It's really good. And, it's interesting to hear him talk about, the fact of the matter is, in order to make something like this, you have to compress a little bit, and you have to sort of change things narratively so that they fit, so that you can tell the story the right way. And you just hope that they do it in a way that's responsible, which I'm convinced that they did. And it turns out, sort of reading further, that Legasov and Sherbina didn't quite have the sort of friendly relationship that they appear to have in the series. It's pretty clear that they made it that way to sort of indicate the way that eventually the sort of scientist types and the government types found a way to work together because they had to. The possibility of the reactor going, China syndrome was so great, and it was one of those things that ideology or wishing it wasn't so, or whatever, was just not going to resolve. Like, you had to have the proper scientific analysis, and you had to have the state willing to do unpleasant things. It's easier to do unpopular things when you're an authoritarian party dictatorship, but the fact that they had to completely evacuate Pripyat, and Pripyat is a ghost town to this day, and lots of areas around that are in this sort of exclusion zone that they just had to tell people, sorry, you have to leave right now. You cannot take your pets. You cannot take, your stuff. You've just got to get on a bus, and that's it. But they had to do it. It just had to be done, even though people weren't going to like it. Once again, it's not like Gorbachev was taking popularity polling numbers or whatever, but they had to do it because the scientists said, look, if you don't get these people out of here, thousands and thousands of people are going to die. And so they had to learn to work together, and to be forced to work together by a situation that was not, that they couldn't talk their way out of. I mean, just had to be, it was what it was.
Yeah, I really cannot sing the praises of this series enough. If anyone has any interest in history or just great, filmmaking, you can't find a better series. And I love the pacing of it. I love the structure. I love the way that we started with the explosion and then we pieced together what happened from there. The last episode is finally like, this is what happened. Jared Harris has this incredibly long and sort of involved monologue at the trial where he is explaining to the government officials what has what he's learned that has happened. And I really, not only did it makes sense, it made me feel like I understood how a nuclear reactor worked. It was informative, but it also managed to be gripping, and it also managed to carry the themes of the show, and it worked on so many levels, and it was just such a phenomenal finale moment for the series, and it's incredible.
Yeah, that scene with Jared Harris is one of the best things I've ever seen in anything. I mean, it's so, that's exactly right. Like, by the end of it, gripping, I think, is the perfect word. They explain in, the sort of technicalities of what happened, and it's not a simple process. I mean, but by the end of it, you understand this is exactly what happened. This is why, this is what they were at fault for. This is what they weren't at fault for. Now, I will say about this show, it's not the kind of thing that you want to watch with young children. There's some fairly grim stuff in it, not surprisingly. So take that as a caveat. But if you're interested in the events, if you're just interested in really excellent dramatic storytelling, it's the best thing I've seen in years. I can't think of another miniseries that I'll just finish by saying it's the perfect length. Many series, like, you think you get to the end of it and you're just like, oh my God, like, they had to sort of stretch out all this.
Right. There's like 3 episodes in the middle that I'm just like, what's the point of this? Like, just get to the end.
Right.
That does not happen with this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's completely not like that. That they sort of interweave a whole bunch of different, 5 or 6 different stories, that all sort of carry the narrative forward and are all really interesting and gripping the entire time. The story of the fireman and his wife, the story of the guy who gets sent out to be on the
Liquidators,
that goes around to shoot the lost pets or whatever. It's just absolutely the best thing around. I think there's some points at which our tastes don't really mesh, and there's some points that we do, and I think this is the thing that we've both mutually enjoyed the most.
Yeah, this is a series that you can get from the library, and at the posting of this, we will hopefully have been open for curbside and drive-through. So feel free to call us and put a hold on it.
Yeah, you can definitely get it through us. You can obviously, if you have the option to subscribe through HBO, you can have instant gratification. But why not get it through us? Because we want to help you. We want to provide it for you. So there you go. Okay, I think that's about all we have for this episode. We'll be back next week with more things we're watching and more things we're listening to.
Yep, we'll see you then.
All right, see you.